Despite these hidden personality flaws, regardless, Kennedy was still pretty well liked by his advisors in particular. And these are people who actually knew a lot of his personality flaws. He tended to surround himself with a lot of people who had similar visions to himself. Um, and they were also much, much younger than in historic traditions with the cabinet. Whereas Eisenhower's cabinet averaged an age of nearly 60, for example, JFK's cabinet members were considerably younger, with an average age of 47. Here you can see his Secretary of Defense, Harvard Business School graduate Robert McNamara. He came more from a business background, and so that's how he approached governing the country, and he was actually pretty good friends with JFK. This is Dean Rusk. He was the Secretary of State who said the eyeball to eyeball and the other fellow just blinked quote. JFK's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs was a man by the name of McGeorge Bundy. His Attorney General was actually his brother Bobby Kennedy. This was interesting since Bobby had never actually practiced law, and now he's the #1 lawyer in the country. But Bobby and JFK were very, very close. They worked very, very closely together, particularly going after organized crime. And Bobby was probably his closest advisor. And then he had a speechwriter by the name of Theodore or Teddy Sorensen. Sorensen was only 32 years old. He is famous for having actually ghost written Profiles in Courage, which was a book that JFK got all the credit for and won the Pulitzer Prize for. Regardless, they stayed pretty decent friends. Richard Godwin was also JFK's, just another one of his speechwriters, and then JFK's press secretary was a man by the name of Pierre Salinger. And here's just an intimate portrait of the Kennedy brothers, Bobby and JFK, deep in thought. So we focused a lot on JFK's foreign policy, but I said that his primary concern was more with his domestic policy. His domestic policy was known as the New Frontier because that's what he sought to bring America on, this new quest, this new path. In order to try to help get legislation passed throughout Congress, he's going to make sure that he does have some Republican friends. Republican C. Douglas Dillon was actually named the Secretary of the Treasury in order to try to help, entice some of the Republicans to vote along with his platform ideas. JFK's biggest goal was to keep the U.S. economically strong. He recognized that there were a lot of facades that were going on in the 50s and that there were some economic problems that needed addressed, and so he hoped, let's have this Republican work with some of my other Democratic advisors, and together we can have a bipartisan approach to dealing with the economic problems of the country. Bipartisan just means appealing to both parties. By both parties, by two parties, get it. Upon trying to take office, one of the things that JFK wanted to do was to try to address some of the unemployment inflation rates that had started to rise, and so he wanted to try to find ways to re-stimulate the economy. In order to do this, he wanted businesses to try to agree to this informal wage and price controls. He wanted them to just say, okay, for a little while, we're not going to change our prices, and we're going to keep our wages, fairly consistent instead of decreasing them, in order that people could buy more stuff, and if you buy more stuff, it makes the economy much more strong. This was all like a really good idea, but it's really hard to make business agree to this when businesses want to make a profit, and they're not going to make a huge profit if they're spending a lot, but they're selling things at a little price. The steel industry in particular was one of those areas that's going to try to undermine JFK. If steel prices were unchecked, if they didn't do these price controls, for example, the entire U.S. economy would have been affected because steel is one of those industries that actually, touches a lot of the other industries. Transportation, for example, building the factories, the automobile industry made from the steels, the making of construction, all these types of things rely on the steel industry. So Roger Blau, who is this man here, he's the president of U.S. Steel. He's kind of the guy who oversees the steel industry in general at the time. He announces that he has agreed to only small increases in the benefits of packages. He's like, okay, I'm going to keep the wages, just slightly higher and keep them pretty steady there. But meanwhile, I'm going to have my prices stay consistent. He publicly had said this, and this was exactly what JFK had wanted. 2 weeks later, he goes back on his word and he raises his prices. So this made JFK, really upset because he was basically publicly undermined. He's like, wait a second, 2 weeks ago, you were publicly telling the country you were going to do what I wanted you to do, and now you're turning around and going and doing the exact opposite. I'm not okay with that. So this is one time when Kennedy, he kind of known for taking this wishy-washy approach to most things. Here he's going to be very assertive and strong. First, he's going to go on TV and he's going to accuse the steel executives of trying to undermine the American economy and trying to hurt everybody else's finances. So he's going to publicly, he's going to sit there and he's going to blast bow. Bobby Kennedy is going to start using his attorney general position to look into the accounting records of the steel business and the various steel industries to see if he can find areas of fraud that he could use as blackmail. McNamara and Rusk are going to start looking for other steel providers for national contracts. At this point, U.S. Steel had been the primary provider for, the U.S. government in terms of the military. So U.S. Steel, we had bought their steel in order to make, battleships and stuff like that, for example. Well, now we're going to go out and be like, you know what? You're going to mess with us. We'll go find somebody else. These are very big contracts that U.S. Steel chose, potentially could have lost. And then the entire Kennedy administration is basically going to go ahead and engage in, it was almost like a war against the steel executives, where they just sat there nonstop, like looking for ways to undermine them. Okay, well then we won't buy anything from U.S. Steel. We won't, we'll find other steel industries. We're going to make sure that you look really bad to the American people. And some people did criticize Kennedy and his administration for being way too heavy-handed. But in this case, Kennedy was determined to make sure that the steel prices didn't get out of hand because he didn't want things to be so unaffordable. And so he is going to ultimately win the respect of a lot of people by willing to take the chance to help the economy stay strong, by willing to go out there, put his reputation on the line, and basically force Blau to step down. And he does. Congress is another area that JFK struggles with. His relationship with Congress was not the greatest. When he was elected president, he had been in the House and the Senate, but only for a very short amount of time. And so they viewed him as like young and unexperienced, and he didn't really know how to play the game of politics. Both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats, and he was a Democrat. So that should have worked to his favor. However, the Democrats that ruled these houses, many of them were Southern Democrats, and they worked with the conservative Republicans to block most of Kennedy's domestic programs because they felt that he was too liberal. So even though his party was in control, his party didn't agree with him personally. In particular, one thing that he wanted to do was he wanted to give tax cuts that would give consumers more money to spend. He's like, I don't want the poor people who can't afford it to have to be paying these really high taxes. He wanted poor people to pay low taxes, rich people to pay higher taxes. Well, who makes up most of Congress? Richer people. And so they were the ones who would have felt this effect. A JFK quote, "I'm convinced that the enactment this year of tax reduction and tax reform overshadows all other domestic problems in Congress." He's like, the most important thing I need to do right now is get money in people's pockets. That has to happen. And he had these various proposals that, if they had listened, would have cut taxes by around $10 billion. And that's $10 billion that would have gone into the average American's pocket. And JFK's hope then would be that they would turn around and that they would spend this, which would stimulate the economy. Congress refused. They're like, no, we're not doing this. We're not going to give these poor people a tax cut. They should go out and find higher paying jobs if they don't like how much money they have. And that to this day continues to be an issue that people debate. Congress is also going to go against some of other JFK's plans. For example, he wanted more medical care for the older people. He wanted to try to pay for some more of their health care. He also wanted more educational plans to be paid for. So he had a lot of these more advanced liberal programs, and Congress just in general was not going to go for that. And part of his sensitivity towards the economic conditions of the poor was that, he came from a very elite rich family. He went to some of the best schools in the world, and, his family was filthy rich, mostly from bootlegging in the Prohibition era. And when he had been campaigning, he went into some of these poor neighborhoods for the first time ever, and he saw firsthand what life was like as a poor person in America. You got to remember, when he was elected president, his worth, in completely unrelated to his presidential salary, was around $2.5 million. That's how much money JFK had. Okay, and so he was like, man, I'm really out of touch with the plight of the poor people. I need to do something to help them out. And so one thing that he does, because a lot of his plans weren't getting passed, is he actually refused to accept his presidential salary, which at the time was around $100,000. Nowadays it's around $450. And he donated it to charity. He's like, fine, you know what? If Congress won't pass my plans, I'll just give my money. Now, I mean, granted, he could have given more, but the fact that he gave some was still pretty good. He also is going to work to pass what's called the Area Redevelopment Act, or the ARA. And this was, again, an economic stimulation package aimed at providing financial assistance to economically distressed regions. I mean, there were places in Appalachia that still didn't have indoor plumbing. There were places that still didn't have electricity. And so he tried to, pass this piece of legislation to help those areas to get financially more secure. And this was a bill that Eisenhower had actually vetoed. He's like, no, we don't need to spend money on this. JFK said, yes, we do, and signed it into law just a couple months into his presidency in May of 1961. Here's a picture of just, what poor life in some areas of America was like during this time period. A year later, Michael Harrington, who is just this author and researcher, is going to go out and he's going to study what he calls the other America. And he's going to write this book where he reports that 42 million Americans were living on less than $1,000 per year. At that point in time, that poverty level was really, really low. I mean, today 15,000 is considered poor. So 1,000, that is very little money. And so it kind of supported JFK's presumption that poverty indeed was an issue that needed to be addressed. It also is going to report that racism was very, very high, and that there was a relationship between racism and poverty, that minority groups tended to be more impoverished than those non-minority groups. And so this is going to inspire JFK not only to continue working towards helping the poor, but also towards creating civil rights legislation. And here you can see the poverty rates over time. It's just an interesting chart to see that during JFK's presidency, indeed, the poverty rate does decrease. His stimulus packages do work. LBJ also, with his Great Society that we'll talk about shortly, is going to help to decrease it. And you have these little blips. Here, there's next to no poverty. Well, that's because a lot of those poor people had been sent off to Vietnam. So keep that in mind. And you can see today that it's up on the rise. In the 90s, poverty was pretty high, and early 80s, poverty was pretty high. That was largely due to inflation. But there was a drastic cut in terms of the poverty rate with JFK's plans. All this being said, he had all these great ideas. Some of them were good, some of them were bad ideas. I guess I should be a little bit more fair. JFK was assassinated. Okay, JFK was killed November 22nd, 1963, riding in an open-top limo in Dallas, Texas. 3 shots, according to the government, were fired, and the last was a fatal headshot. And when he died, there was this huge question mark over what was going to happen. Was the vice president, LBJ, who's going to take over, is LBJ going to continue JFK's reforms, or is he going to do something completely different? For some people, his assassination is his legacy. That's all that he left behind. For a lot of people who aren't huge JFK fans, so I'm trying to be more fair, they're going to say the only thing that JFK did and the only thing he should be remembered for is his death. Others, however, are going to say, here's a quote, "He offered a vast promise to a new generation of Americans. He inspired the nation with a heroic vision of the presidency as the center of action in American life." Agree or disagree, we can have this conversation. Obviously I have my personal feelings. I don't think he was a perfect president by any means. I wouldn't put him as one of the best presidents. He's somewhere in the middle in my world. But I would say that he had so many good ideas and he was so inspirational to so many people. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened had he lived. Sadly, we're never going to die, and sadly, we're never going to know for sure because of his death. And so, as a result, we're left with LBJ, and what does he do?